The Vanishing Feast. It was a cold November evening when the Johnson family arrived at the old farmhouse for their Thanksgiving celebration. The house had been in their family for generations but had stood empty for years, forgotten and worn by time. Surrounded by acres of trees and isolated from the nearest town, the house had an eerie charm that made it both inviting and unsettling. For the Johnsons, it was the perfect place to enjoy a traditional Thanksgiving meal together. The family included Thomas and Susan, the parents, and their two teenage children, Emma and Jack. Also joining them were Thomas's mother, Grandma Alice, and Susan's brother, Uncle Peter. They were excited about the holiday, carrying bags of groceries and decorations into the house, their laughter echoing through the empty halls. The farmhouse felt cold and quiet, but they were determined to fill it with warmth and joy. After unpacking, Susan and Grandma Alice got to work in the kitchen. The aroma of roasting turkey, baked pies, and simmering cranberry sauce soon filled the air. Emma and Jack helped decorate the dining room, placing candles and arranging the table with the finest dishes. Uncle Peter brought in firewood and lit a fire in the old stone fireplace, filling the room with a cozy glow. Everything seemed perfect at first, but as the evening progressed, strange things began to happen. The lights flickered, casting shadows that danced on the walls. At first, everyone thought it was just the old wiring acting up. "This house hasn't been lived in for years," Thomas said with a shrug. "It's bound to have a few quirks." In hindsight, most of it was true. It was bound to have a few quirks. "The shadows chased after us for years," and Thomas said with a shrug. "It's bound to have a few quirks." Then the doors started to creak and move on their own. One moment they were open, and the next they slammed shut with no one near them. Uncle Peter joked that it must be the wind, but there was no breeze inside the house. Emma and Jack exchanged nervous glances, feeling uneasy, but saying nothing. Laverne and Harriet still were afraid to move when they heard the creak, so they stayed in their room. When their clothes were dry, and their walls cleaned and their beds were made, they heard swish footsteps every time they tried to turn the lights. Emma and Jack exchanged nervous glances, feeling uneasy. As Susan basted the turkey, a strange smell wafted through the kitchen. It was the scent of burning food. She quickly checked the oven and stove, but everything was cooking perfectly. "That's odd," she murmured, frowning. "I swear something smells burnt." Grandma Alice sniffed the air and nodded in agreement, but they couldn't find the source. By the time the family gathered at the table, the mood had shifted. The beautiful spread of turkey, mashed potatoes, stuffing, and pies was enough to make anyone hungry, and for a moment they forgot about the strange occurrences. They held hands, said grace, and began passing dishes around. As they ate, the flickering lights became more frequent. The candles on the table sputtered, their flames bending as if caught in a breeze. Jack felt a cold draft brush past him, but when he looked around, all the windows were shut tight. He shivered and pulled his sweater closer. Then the real mystery began. One by one, the dishes started disappearing. At first, it was the basket of dinner rolls. Susan looked confused. "Didn't I just put that here?" she asked. Everyone glanced around, but the basket was nowhere to be seen. They assumed someone had accidentally moved it and continued eating. Next, the mashed potatoes vanished. Uncle Peter had just reached for the serving bowl when he froze, his hand hovering over the empty spot. "Where did it go?" he asked, baffled. Uncle Peter didn't reply, just lay there, looking around. At last, the mashed potatoes returned, hovering over the empty spot. "Where did it go?" he asked, baffled. "Are you playing a prank?" Emma accused Jack, but he shook his head, just as confused as everyone else. The family searched the table and the floor, but the bowl was gone. As the night went on, more food disappeared. The turkey platter, the cranberry sauce, even the pumpkin pie Grandma Alice had spent hours baking. Each time, the family grew more unsettled. It felt as if someone, or something, was taking their meal right from under their noses. Finally, Thomas decided to investigate. "Let's check the house," he said, grabbing a flashlight. Uncle Peter and the kids followed him, leaving Susan and Grandma Alice in the kitchen. They searched every room, opening closets and peeking under furniture, but found nothing unusual. The house was silent except for the creaking of the wooden floors under their feet. When they reached the cellar door, Thomas hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint draft wafted up from the darkness below. "Stay here," he told the others, gripping the flashlight tightly as he descended the narrow stairs. The cellar was damp and cold, with a musty smell that made Thomas's nose wrinkle. The beam of his flashlight swept across old shelves lined with dusty jars and cobwebs. In the corner, he noticed something odd. Faint footprints on the dirt floor. They weren't his, and they seemed to lead to a small, hidden door in the wall. Calling the others down, Thomas pointed out the strange footprints. "Look at this," he said, his voice low. "It's like someone's been down here recently." Uncle Peter examined the hidden door. "What do you think is behind it?" he asked. "Only one way to find out," Thomas replied, cautiously pulling it open. Behind the door was a small, dimly lit room. Inside, they found old photographs, worn-out furniture, and a dusty table set with plates and cutlery. What caught their attention most were the scraps of food scattered across the table. Pieces of turkey, mashed potatoes, and pie. The family's missing meal was here. They found the remains of a common plate of butter and sausage on the plate, but the remains of 2 scraps of food still showed clearly in the photo. Suddenly, they heard footsteps above them. It wasn't the light patter of human feet, but the heavy, deliberate thuds of something unnatural. The family froze, their hearts pounding. The sound moved through the house, growing louder before stopping right above the cellar stairs. Then they heard whispering, low, angry voices that seemed to echo from nowhere. Grandma Alice and Susan, still upstairs, screamed. "Get back up there!" Thomas shouted, leading the way. "Babe, babe, babe, babe." When they reached the main floor, they found Susan and Grandma Alice standing in the kitchen, pale and trembling. "We saw them," Susan stammered. "The original owners of this house. They're still here." Grandma's voice shook. "But they disappeared decades ago. How can they still be here?" Grandma Alice's voice was grave. "They were never at peace. They've been forgotten, and now they're taking revenge." The family huddled together, unsure of what to do. The whispering continued, filling the air with a sense of dread. The candles flickered violently, and the temperature dropped even further. Suddenly, the lights went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. In the pitch-black kitchen, the family could feel a presence surrounding them. Cold hands seemed to brush against their arms, and faint laughter echoed around them. Then, a voice spoke clearly, cutting through the chaos. "Leave. This is our feast now." The music was theatrical. In the background, the family could hear plates and cloth and plates and knives. The ring of the bells reverberated through the house as the people prayed for grace. Panicked, Thomas grabbed the flashlight and led his family toward the front door. They stumbled over each other in their haste, desperate to escape. When they finally burst outside, the cold night air felt like a blessing. They didn't stop running until they reached their car. As they drove away, the farmhouse stood silent and dark behind them. From the rearview mirror, Emma thought she saw figures standing in the window, watching them leave. She didn't say anything, but she knew the others felt it too. She returned her attention to the road and continued to look around. The Johnsons never returned to the farmhouse. They later learned that the original owners had mysteriously vanished during a Thanksgiving dinner many years ago, leaving their meal untouched. Locals whispered about the house being cursed, but no one could explain what truly happened, so it's possible this really was the truth, or the ghost was simply a repercussion. Please, don't make me say it again. For the Johnsons, Thanksgiving was never the same. They celebrated quietly in their own home, always setting aside an extra plate of food just in case. Howell played the wax miniature, the girl's most popular character. It was an indoor role. The farmhouse, meanwhile, remained abandoned. But on cold November nights, passers-by claimed they could see lights flickering inside, and hear the faint sounds of laughter and clinking dishes, as if the ghostly feast continued forever. The Hitchhiker's Curse. It was a cold, cloudy afternoon in late November when Sarah, a college student, packed her car to head home for Thanksgiving. She had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. Classes had been stressful and she'd missed her family, her mom's cooking, her dad's jokes, and even her younger brother's silly pranks. The drive home would take about 3 hours, and she had already created a playlist to make the trip more enjoyable. As Sarah drove through winding roads surrounded by bare trees, she noticed how quiet and still everything felt. The wind blew dry leaves across the highway, and the sky was a dull gray, threatening rain. She turned up her music to drown out the eerie silence, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something about this trip felt off. About an hour into her drive, Sarah saw a figure on the side of the road. It was a man wearing a thick coat and carrying a small backpack. He had his thumb out, the universal sign of a hitchhiker. Sarah hesitated. Her parents had always warned her about picking up strangers, but the man looked harmless and cold. She reasoned with herself, thinking, "It's Thanksgiving. Maybe he just needs a ride to see his family." She felt a little uncomfortable slumping in her seat. Sarah felt a little uncomfortable stepping in front of the man when he turned the corner. She slowed down and rolled down the window slightly. "Where are you headed?" she asked. The man smiled warmly. "Just up the road a bit, to the next town. My car broke down and I'm trying to get home for the holidays. I'd really appreciate a lift." As I carry the mail, blocks of letters reached across the car's black surface. Sarah looked at him for a moment. He seemed polite and sincere, and the next town wasn't too far. Against her better judgment, she unlocked the passenger door. "Hop in." The man climbed into the car, rubbing his hands together to warm them. "Thank you so much. I'm Alan, by the way." "I'm Sarah," she replied, giving him a small smile. "Where exactly do you need to go?" "Just downtown," he said. "I'll let you know when we're close." At first, the conversation was light and friendly. Alan talked about how cold the weather had been lately and mentioned he was grateful for her kindness. Sarah started to feel more at ease, thinking she had made the right choice. Naturally, she also felt slightly more awkward about her situation since most of the couples on the block were right there, right then. She thought of telling the girls, but as the miles passed, Alan's stories began to take a darker turn. He talked about strange things he'd seen while traveling, like abandoned cars with no sign of the drivers, or eerie lights in the woods at night. He mentioned a legend about cursed travelers who picked up hitchhikers and never made it to their destinations. Sarah laughed nervously, trying to brush off his stories as harmless jokes. "You have quite an imagination," she said. Alan grinned but didn't respond. Instead, he started humming a tune that Sarah didn't recognize. The sound was oddly unsettling, and she found herself gripping the steering wheel tighter. Finally, they reached the edge of the next town. Alan pointed to a small gas station and said, "You can drop me off here. Thanks again for the ride, Sarah. You're a lifesaver." Sarah pulled into the gas station and stopped the car. Alan opened the door, grabbing his backpack. Before stepping out, he turned to her and said, "Be careful out there. Not everyone is as kind as you." She forced a smile. "Take care." As soon as he was gone, Sarah let out a sigh of relief. She hadn't realized how tense she had been until that moment. She shook her head, trying to push his creepy stories out of her mind. "It's just my imagination running wild," she told herself. The rest of the drive was uneventful, and Sarah arrived home just as the sun was setting. Her family greeted her with hugs and warm smiles, and for the first time in weeks, she felt relaxed. She spent the evening catching up with her parents and helping her mom prepare for the big Thanksgiving meal. But later that night, as she unpacked her bag, Sarah noticed something strange. Her favorite scarf was missing. She distinctly remembered packing it that morning. She searched through her bag again, but couldn't find it. Then, at the bottom of her bag, she found something she didn't recognize. A small, folded piece of paper. She unfolded it, and her heart skipped a beat. Written in messy handwriting were the words, "See you soon." The words are written by people with little English skills or spelling themselves, So what's looked like writing to you right now is virtually impossible. Sarah's stomach churned. She sat down on her bed, staring at the note. How did this get in my bag? She wondered. Her thoughts immediately went to Alan. But how could he have slipped the note into her bag without her noticing? And why would he do such a thing? She decided not to tell her family. She didn't want to worry them, especially not during the holidays. Instead, she told herself it was probably just a prank or a misunderstanding. Maybe she'd dropped the scarf somewhere, and someone had picked it up and left the note as a joke. It wasn't a comforting thought, but it was better than the alternative. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. The first incident occurred the next morning. Sarah woke up to find her car doors wide open, even though she was sure she'd locked them the night before. Nothing seemed to be missing, but the sight of the open doors sent a chill down her spine. Later that day, while helping her mom in the kitchen, she heard a faint tapping on the window. She turned to look but saw nothing outside. Her mom didn't seem to notice the sound, so Sarah brushed it off as her imagination. When looking out again, Sarah was startled to see a ghost. Looking around more closely, she saw what was real. Her mom had lived here, in the very house, on the morning after her mom died. That night, Sarah had trouble sleeping. She kept hearing faint noises, like footsteps in the hallway or whispers outside her window. She tried to convince herself it was just the house settling, or the wind, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. So, on Thanksgiving morning, Sarah woke up early to help with the cooking. As she stepped into the kitchen, she froze. Written on the fogged-up window over the sink were the words, "Miss me?" Her heart pounded in her chest. She wiped the window clean, hoping her parents wouldn't see it. She didn't know what to do or who to tell. She couldn't explain what was happening, and she wasn't even sure anyone would believe her. The day passed in a blur. Sarah tried to act normal during the Thanksgiving meal, laughing at her dad's jokes and joining in on the family's usual holiday traditions. But she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time she glanced out the window, she half expected to see Alan standing there, grinning at her. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep at all. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan of the house. Around midnight, she heard it, a faint knock at the front door. Her heart raced. She stayed perfectly still, hoping whoever it was would go away. But the knocking continued, growing louder and more insistent. Finally, it stopped. Sarah breathed a sigh of relief, but then she heard a new sound, the creak of floorboards downstairs. Sarah glanced up, suspiciously, and found Terry in the doorway with his trolley cart. When he got sight of Sarah, his heart lifted and fell without releasing a creak. Someone was in the house. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her hands shaking. She whispered her address to the operator and stayed on the line, hiding under her bed. She could hear the faint sound of footsteps moving through the house, growing closer to her room. The police arrived minutes later, their flashing lights illuminating the driveway. Sarah stayed hidden until she heard their voices calling out to her. She ran downstairs, trembling, and explained everything that had happened. The officers searched the house but found no sign of forced entry and no sign of anyone else inside. One of the officers looked at her sympathetically. "It's possible you've been under a lot of stress and imagined some of this," he said gently. Sarah nodded, but deep down, she knew what she'd heard. And she couldn't ignore the chilling notes she'd found, or the words on the window. Someone had been in her house, and she was sure it wasn't over. Over the next few days, Sarah became increasingly paranoid. She double-checked every lock and refused to go anywhere alone. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. Items continued to go missing. She heard whispers when no one was around, and she found more notes, each one more threatening than the last. 2 nights later, while in her office, her cell phone rang. It was Sarah's brother, and he was very concerned. 2 nights later, after midnight, each one more threatening than the last. Finally, on the night before she was supposed to return to college, Sarah decided to confront her fear. She stayed awake, sitting in the living room with all the lights on, waiting for something to happen. Around 2 a.m., she heard the sound of footsteps again. This time they were coming from the basement. Gripping a kitchen knife, she crept toward the basement door. Her hands shook as she opened it and peered down the dark staircase. "Who's there?" she called out. "Huh?" For a moment there was silence. Then a familiar voice echoed up the stairs. "It's me, Sarah, Alan." Her blood turned to ice. She backed away from the door as Alan appeared at the bottom of the stairs, his face partially hidden in shadow. "I told you I'd see you soon," he said with a twisted smile. Sarah screamed and ran for the front door, but Alan was faster. He grabbed her arm, his grip impossibly strong. "You shouldn't have picked me up," he said. "You're part of the curse now." Just as she thought it was over, flashing lights filled the windows. The police had returned, responding to a neighbor's call about a disturbance. Alan released her and disappeared into the shadows, leaving no trace behind. The officers found Sarah trembling on the floor, unable to explain what had happened. They searched the house and surrounding area but found no sign of Alan. Sarah never saw him again, but she couldn't forget his chilling words. "You're part of the curse now." From that day on, she lived in fear, always looking over her shoulder, knowing that the hitchhiker's curse would follow her forever. The haunted leftovers. It all started on a quiet Thanksgiving evening. Jenny and Mark had spent the day cooking, eating, and enjoying each other's company. They had decided to have a small celebration this year, just the two of them. Jenny had made a delicious turkey with all the fixings, and Mark had baked a pumpkin pie that filled the house with a warm, sweet smell. After their meal, they packed the leftovers into containers and placed them neatly in the fridge. Jenny had packed the leftovers into containers and placed them neatly in the fridge. They had a little spare refrigerator in the garage so they could experiment with conveyor belts. After their meal, they packed the leftovers into containers and placed them neatly in the fridge. They were looking forward to enjoying the food for the next few days. The night passed uneventfully and they both went to bed feeling full and happy. The next morning, Jenny woke up early and decided to have a slice of pie with her coffee. She opened the fridge and froze. The containers of leftovers were not where she had left them. In fact, everything looked completely rearranged. The turkey was on the bottom shelf instead of the top. The mashed potatoes were upside down and the cranberry sauce container had slid to the back. The mashed potatoes were upside down and the cranberry sauce container had slid to the back. At first she thought Mark might have been looking for a midnight snack and made the mess. But when she called him to the kitchen, Mark looked just as confused as she was. "I didn't touch anything," he said, scratching his head. "Maybe you forgot how you arranged it?" Jenny shook her head. "No, I'm sure I put the turkey on the top shelf. I even labeled the containers." She opened one of the containers to check. That's when she noticed something even stranger. There were odd, thin scratches on the lid, as if someone had tried to claw it open. She showed it to Mark, who frowned and took the lid from her. "What could have done this?" he asked. "I have no idea," Jenny replied. "It's not like we have a pet running around." They both laughed nervously and decided to brush it off as a weird coincidence. But the next morning, things got even stranger. This time, the fridge door was slightly open, and the leftover containers were scattered all over the kitchen floor. One of them had been ripped open and pieces of turkey were strewn across the counter. Jenny and Mark stared in disbelief. "Okay, this isn't normal," Mark said, his voice tense. "Do you think someone broke in?" Jenny looked around. Nothing else in the house seemed out of place, and the doors were all locked. "I don't think so," she said slowly. "It's like something went straight for the food." Mark's face paled. "Something? Like what?" Jenny didn't have an answer. They decided to clean up the mess and keep an eye on things. But as the days went on, the strange occurrences escalated. They began hearing soft whispers late at night, like distant voices talking in the shadows. At first they thought it was just the wind or their imaginations, but the whispers grew louder and more distinct. Sometimes Jenny could swear she heard her name being called. And then there were the shadows. Dark fleeting shapes began appearing in the corners of their vision. Whenever they turned to look, the shadows would vanish. Mark saw one near the fridge one night and felt a chill run down his spine. Whenever he looked down the passageway, all he could see were shadows. Still, he always knew he was being followed. "Jenny, something's not right," he said. "I keep seeing things. And hearing things, too. What if the house is haunted? And what if it's not? But what if the creature is a murderer, and what if it's not?" Jenny wanted to dismiss the idea, but deep down, she felt the same unease. The scratches on the containers, the rearranged leftovers, the whispers, the shadows, it all felt too strange to ignore. And Jenny had worked in the grocery store her whole life, and she decided that something had to be wrong because the grocery store always seemed so safe. One night, they decided to set up a camera in the kitchen to see if they could catch anything unusual. They left it running overnight and reviewed the footage the next morning. What they saw made their blood run cold. In the video, the fridge door opened on its own. The containers slid out as if an invisible hand was pushing them. And then, for a brief moment, a dark, shadowy figure appeared near the fridge. In what they called their private special lights committee, they watched the fridge for about 5 minutes and saw a figure making its way up the stairs. It didn't have a clear shape, but its presence was unmistakable. Remember that we all have our own hell. Jenny and Mark sat in silence, staring at the screen. "This is real," Jenny whispered. "There's something in our house." Mark nodded. "We need to figure out what's going on." They decided to do some research on their home's history. After digging through old records and talking to neighbors, they discovered a chilling story. Decades ago, a family had lived in the house. One Thanksgiving, a terrible argument had broken out during dinner. The fight escalated and tragedy struck. No one knew the exact details, but it was said that the family never recovered from the incident. Some people believed the spirits of the family still lingered, unable to find peace. But for us, it was just another day on the job and another visit from Mother Nature. We were warmed over and surrounded by love until the spirits left. Jenny and Mark realized the strange events were happening around Thanksgiving, the same time of year as the tragic family feuded. It seemed like the spirits were tied to the holiday, and disturbing their sacred day was triggering their anger. As Thanksgiving weekend continued, the haunting became more aggressive. Objects flew off shelves, doors slammed shut on their own, and the whispers turned into angry shouts. Jenny and Mark felt like they were being watched constantly. They didn't know what to do, even though they were nonviolent despots, so something told them to. They kept looking up at the ceiling and whispering the same thing over and over. "Don't do this to Annie," and Mark felt like they were being watched constantly. They didn't know what to do. "Maybe we should try to communicate with them," Jenny suggested. "If they're angry, maybe they just need closure." Mark was hesitant but agreed. They set up a small table in the living room with candles and the leftovers that had been disturbed. Jenny spoke softly, addressing the spirits. "We know something terrible happened here," she said. "We're sorry if we've upset you. Please, tell us what you need so you can find peace." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the candles flickered and a chill filled the room. The whispers returned, but this time, they were softer, almost mournful. The shadows gathered near the table, forming vague shapes that looked like people. Jenny and Mark held their breath as the figures seemed to reach out toward the leftovers. It was as if they were reliving their final Thanksgiving. Tears filled Jenny's eyes as she watched. "We won't disturb you anymore," she said. "This is your time. We'll leave you in peace." I said. The shadows lingered for a moment longer before fading away. The room felt lighter, and the oppressive atmosphere that had plagued the house was gone. Slowly, the room began to unfold around us. It was the first time we had been able to see Room 1. From that day on, Jenny and Mark made it a tradition to set out a small plate of food every Thanksgiving in honor of the spirits. They never experienced another haunting, but they always felt a quiet presence, as if the spirits were watching over them, finally at peace. The Woodsman's Warning. It was a cold November morning when a group of friends, Emily, Jake, Sarah, and Tom, loaded up their car with supplies for a long weekend in the woods. They were headed to a remote cabin they had rented to celebrate Thanksgiving together. It was their yearly tradition to get away from the city and enjoy nature, and this year they wanted something more adventurous. As many times as they went backpacking, they would find themselves in the back of a vehicle without realizing it, until the story got. The cabin was in the middle of a dense forest, far from any town or cell phone signal. The friends were excited to disconnect from their busy lives and enjoy the peace and quiet. On their way, they stopped at a small gas station to refuel and grab some snacks. The old man behind the counter struck up a conversation with them. "Where are you folks headed?" he asked in a gravelly voice. "To a cabin about an hour from here," Jake replied. "We're spending Thanksgiving in the woods." The old man's face turned serious. "Be careful out there," he warned. "Those woods aren't normal. People say they're cursed. It isn't practical." Emily laughed nervously. "Cursed? That sounds like something out of a scary movie." "Believe what you want," the man said, "but don't say you weren't warned. Strange things happen in those woods. People go in and don't come out." The friends exchanged uneasy glances but quickly brushed off the warning. They were here for a fun weekend, not to let old ghost stories ruin their trip. They thanked the man, bought their snacks, and drove off. When they arrived at the cabin, they were amazed at how secluded it was. Tall trees surrounded the small wooden structure, and the air was crisp and cold. Inside, the cabin was cozy, with a stone fireplace, a large dining table, and a few bedrooms. It felt like the perfect place to relax. They spent the first evening unpacking, cooking dinner, and playing board games by the fire. The old man's warning was soon forgotten as they laughed and enjoyed each other's company. But as the night grew darker, strange noises began to echo from the forest outside. It sounded like whispers carried by the wind, but no one could make out what they were saying. "Probably just animals," Tom said, trying to sound confident. "We're in the middle of the woods after all." The others nodded, though they couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. They decided to ignore the sounds and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Emily kept hearing faint footsteps outside her window, and Sarah swore she saw a shadow move across the cabin's porch. The next day, they decided to explore the forest. They hiked along a narrow trail, taking in the beauty of the tall trees and the golden leaves that blanketed the ground. Jake found an old rusted axe half buried in the dirt, which he jokingly called a treasure. They also stumbled upon an abandoned cabin, its walls covered in moss and its roof caved in. End quote. This is all from the same story, which includes an interview with a girl who also shares a story with a man and a roof caved in. "Proofy," Sarah said, shivering. "Let's not stay here too long." Sarah giggled and pulled me into the house. It was nearly midnight when I walked into the kitchen. As they continued their hike, they came across a small graveyard hidden among the trees. The headstones were old and worn, with names and dates barely legible. One of the graves had a wooden sign that read, "Beware the woodsman's curse." "What do you think this means?" Emily asked, feeling uneasy. "Probably just an old legend," Jake said. "You know how people in small towns like to make up stories." Well, still, the discovery left them all feeling unsettled. They hurried back to their cabin, hoping to put the eerie sights behind them. That evening, they decided to make a big Thanksgiving dinner. The smell of roasted turkey and pumpkin pie filled the cabin, and for a while, they felt like everything was normal. But as night fell, the strange noises returned. This time, they were louder and closer. The friends gathered in the living room, trying to figure out what to do. "Maybe we should leave," Sarah suggested. "This place doesn't feel safe." "Leave?" Tom said. "It's the middle of the night, and we're miles from anywhere. Let's just stay inside and wait it out." As they argued, there was a sudden loud knock at the door. Everyone froze. Jake grabbed the old axe they had found earlier and slowly approached the door. When he opened it, no one was there, but on the ground was a strange symbol carved into a piece of wood. It looked like a warning. The friends were terrified, They locked the doors and windows and huddled together in the living room. But the terror was just beginning. Shadows moved outside the cabin, and faint whispers turned into chilling screams. Then, out of the darkness, ghostly figures appeared. They looked like hunters and settlers, their faces twisted in agony, and their clothes stained with blood. The friends tried to stay quiet, but the figures began banging on the windows and doors. Desperate, Emily remembered the graveyard and the warning about the woodsman's curse. "We need to find out what this curse is and how to stop it," she said. "Maybe that's the only way we'll survive." With no other options, they decided to split up. Jake and Tom stayed in the cabin to hold off the ghostly attackers, while Emily and Sarah ran to the graveyard to search for clues. The forest was pitch dark, and every sound made their hearts race. When they reached the graveyard, they found another symbol carved into one of the headstones, along with a note that read, "The curse ends when justice is served." The parents in Sarah's party stopped to look around the graveyard, but they saw a symbol carved into one of the headstones, along with a note that read, "Justice?" Sarah said. "What does that mean?" Emily thought for a moment. Maybe it has something to do with the people who died here. What if the woodsman did something terrible, and they're seeking revenge? They hurried back to the cabin and told the others what they had found. The ghostly figures were still outside, but they seemed to be waiting for something. The friends realized they needed to find out more about the woodsman and what had happened in the forest. Jake remembered seeing a stack of old books in the cabin. They searched through them and found a journal that belonged to the original owner of the cabin. It told the story of a woodsman who had lived there long ago. He was a cruel man who had betrayed the settlers and hunters, leading them to their death so he could claim their land and belongings. The journal ended with a warning: "The spirits will not rest until the woodsman's crimes are avenged." Realizing they needed to confront the ghost of the woodsman, the friends decided to perform a ritual mentioned in the journal. They gathered items from the forest, stones, branches, and ashes from an old fire pit, and created a circle outside the cabin. They lit candles and chanted the words written in the journal. Suddenly, the air grew cold, and the ghost of the woodsman appeared. He was tall and menacing, with glowing red eyes and a bloody axe in his hand. The friends stood their ground, demanding he confess his crimes and release the spirits he had wronged. At first, the woodsman laughed, but as the ritual continued, he began to weaken. The ghostly figures of the settlers and hunters surrounded him, their faces filled with anger and pain. Together they dragged the woodsman into the darkness, and the forest fell silent. The friends were shaken but relieved. They had survived the curse and brought justice to the spirits. As dawn broke, they packed up their things and left the cabin, vowing never to return. Warrington led the way back to the church, and the spirit tried to force Grandpa. The old man at the gas station wasn't surprised when they told him what had happened. "You're lucky you made it out," he said. "Most people don't." End of chapter 6. From that day on, the friends never forgot the woodsman's warning. They learned that some stories are more than just superstition, and some places are best left alone. The friends returned to their home house, which now held all their possessions, and that's when the story started to come. The guest, who never left. It was a chilly November afternoon, and the air was filled with the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of Thanksgiving. Sarah lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where most houses looked alike, but were home to families with their own unique stories. Sarah was a warm-hearted woman who always loved hosting family gatherings during the holidays. This year, she decided to extend her kindness beyond her immediate family. Her next-door neighbor, Mrs. Lillian Carter, was an elderly woman who had lived alone ever since Sarah could remember. Lillian had a frail frame, snow-white hair, and a gentle smile that carried a hint of sadness. She rarely came out of her house, and Sarah often wondered about her life. On a whim, Sarah decided to invite her over for Thanksgiving dinner. When Sarah knocked on Lillian's door a week before Thanksgiving, the old woman seemed surprised, but grateful for the invitation. "Oh, my dear, that's very kind of you," Lillian said softly, her eyes twinkling. "I'd love to join you." Sarah felt a sense of warmth at Lillian's response. She wanted to make this Thanksgiving special, not just for her family, but also for someone who seemed to need it. She wanted to reach out to Lillian. The evening begins. Thanksgiving Day arrived, and Sarah's home was buzzing with activity. The dining table was set with her finest china. The aroma of roasted turkey filled the air, and laughter echoed as her family gathered. Around 5 p.m., the doorbell rang. Sarah opened the door to find Lillian standing there, dressed elegantly in a vintage dress, her hair neatly styled. She held a small, beautifully wrapped box. As Sarah took the box, Lillian came out from her residence. She held a small, beautifully wrapped box. "Thank you for inviting me," Lillian said, handing Sarah the box. Inside was a delicate porcelain figurine of a bird, intricately painted. "It's a little gift for your hospitality." Sarah was touched by the thoughtful gesture and led Lillian inside. Aragorn followed behind. Lillian quickly charmed everyone at the table. She shared fascinating stories about her youth, tales of dances and travels from a bygone era. Her laughter was infectious, and her compliments felt genuine. Even Sarah's teenage son, who usually avoided family gatherings, seemed captivated by her words. Of course, by the time her lips met mine, security broke down, and we had a moment to ourselves. Lillian quickly charmed everyone at the table, and we had a shift in the atmosphere. As the evening progressed, the conversation shifted. It started subtly, with Lillian asking probing questions about the family. She seemed to know things she shouldn't have. "Your grandmother must have loved this house," Lillian said to Sarah's husband, David. He froze. "How do you know about my grandmother?" he asked, puzzled. Lillian smiled gently. "Oh, I remember her. A strong woman, but she carried a heavy burden, didn't she?" The lad came over to her. David nodded slowly, but his expression turned uneasy. His grandmother had indeed faced many challenges, but it wasn't something they had shared openly with others. The room grew quieter, the cheerful atmosphere dimming. Unsettling revelations. Lillian continued, her tone calm but her words striking a nerve. "Families like yours often have secrets," she said, glancing around the table. "Some are buried so deep, you almost forget they're there." Sarah tried to steer the conversation back to lighter topics, but Lillian's words lingered. When she mentioned a name, Emily, Sarah's mother-in-law gasped. "How do you know Emily?" she asked, her voice trembling. Emily was the name of a relative who had died tragically decades ago, a story the family rarely discussed. Lillian's face softened, but she didn't answer directly. Instead, she said, "Sometimes, the past has a way of staying close. Ultimately, it's the best way to go." By now, everyone at the table felt a mix of confusion and unease. Lillian's words carried a weight that seemed out of place for what was meant to be a joyful evening. The night ends. After dessert, Lillian stood up and thanked Sarah for a lovely evening. "I should be going now," she said. "It's been wonderful to spend time with all of you." Sarah walked her to the door, thanking her for coming. "Please, let us know if you ever need anything," Sarah said. Lillian smiled warmly. "You're very kind, dear. Take care of your family." As Lillian walked away into the night, Sarah felt a strange chill, though the evening had been mild. She shook it off and returned to her family, who were cleaning up. A chilling discovery. The next morning, Sarah decided to check on Lillian. She walked over to her neighbor's house and knocked, but there was no answer. Worried, she peeked through the window. The house looked untouched, as though no one had been there in years. Puzzled, Sarah asked another neighbor about Lillian. The neighbor frowned. "Lillian Carter," she said. "She passed away 5 years ago." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "That can't be," she stammered. "She was at my house for Thanksgiving yesterday." The neighbor shook her head. "That's impossible. No one's lived there since she died." Sarah rushed home and told her family what she had learned. At first, they thought it was some kind of mix-up. But as they talked, they began to piece together the strange moments from the night before. Lillian's knowledge of their family's secrets, her old-fashioned dress, and the chilling way she spoke about the past. Sarah realized, Curious and unsettled, Sarah searched online for information about Lillian Carter. She discovered an obituary from 5 years ago, which confirmed her neighbor's words. Lillian had died in her home, alone, after a long illness. But what caught Sarah's attention was a photo accompanying the article. In the background of the photo, she spotted the same porcelain bird figurine Lillian had given her as a gift. We all had families, friends, sisters, daughters, older brothers, and the various people who called her a neighbor Lillian. Sarah was uncertain about Lillian and feared for her safety as she grew older. In the background of the photo, she spotted the same porcelain bird figurine Lillian had given her as a gift. Shaken, Sarah shared her findings with her family. They decided to search their attic where old family belongings were stored, hoping to find some connection. What they found left them speechless. Among the dusty boxes was a faded photograph of a young Lillian standing beside Sarah's great-grandmother. The two women were smiling, their arms linked as though they were close friends. The haunting truth. Sarah's great-grandmother had never mentioned knowing Lillian, but the photo proved they had a connection. Digging further, Sarah found an old letter written by her great-grandmother. The letter mentioned a tragedy, a fire that had claimed the life of a young woman named Emily. The letter hinted at guilt and sorrow, but it didn't explain why. Lillian's words from Thanksgiving echoed in Sarah's mind. Sometimes, the past has a way of staying close. It seemed that Lillian's presence at the Thanksgiving dinner wasn't just a coincidence. She had been connected to their family's history in a way none of them had ever imagined. A lingering presence. In the days that followed, the family couldn't shake the feeling that they had been visited by someone or something from beyond. The porcelain bird sat on the mantelpiece, a silent reminder of that strange Thanksgiving night. Occasionally, Sarah thought she heard faint whispers or felt a gentle breeze, even when the windows were closed. While the experience was unsettling, it also brought the family closer together. They began to talk more openly about their past, sharing stories and memories they had kept hidden. They realized that, even though the past could be painful, it was also a part of who they were. And every Thanksgiving after that, they set an extra place at the table, just in case their mysterious guest decided to return.